Help your family, or stay out, Dad demanded when I refused to pay his debts. I chose the second option, tired of their endless demands. 3 days later, a lawyer contacted me. I stared at my phone, heart pounding, rereading my father's message for the third time. Help your family, or stay out. That was it. No explanation, no discussion, just an ultimatum. And for the first time in my life, I made the choice I should have made years ago. I chose myself. I locked my phone and tossed it onto the couch. The silence in my tiny apartment felt foreign, unsettling. For as long as I could remember, I had lived under the weight of my father's reckless decisions, pulling him out of every financial disaster he created. The gambling debts, the failed business ventures, the credit card bills that he always swore he'd pay back, except he never did. I was his walking, breathing bailout fund, and he never even had the decency to feel ashamed of it. But this time was different. This time, when he called, voice dripping with that familiar mixture of entitlement and irritation, I said no. And he had laughed. He actually laughed, as if the idea of me refusing to save him was absurd, a joke. Then his voice had turned cold. He told me I could either help my family, or stay out. And I had simply replied, then I'll stay out. I expected the guilt to hit me right away. But as I sat there, staring at the ceiling, all I felt was exhaustion. Then relief. For the first time in my life, I was free. Or so I thought. Because 3 days later, I got a call from a lawyer that changed everything. The call came while I was making coffee, the cheap kind that tasted like burnt cardboard but kept me functional. The number was unfamiliar, and for a second, I debated letting it go to voicemail. But something told me to pick up. Is this Daniel Carter? The voice on the other end was formal, professional. Yeah. Who's asking? Mr. Carter, my name is James Holloway. I'm an attorney representing the estate of Richard Carter. Do you have a moment to discuss your uncle's will? I almost dropped the coffee mug. My uncle? I racked my brain, trying to place the name. My father's side of the family was a tangled mess, full of distant relatives I barely knew. But Richard, Uncle Rick, I remembered him. Barely. My father always called him a loser, said he was a waste of space, someone who never amounted to anything. I hadn't seen him in over a decade. Yes, the lawyer continued. Richard Carter passed away 2 weeks ago, and as his sole beneficiary, you need to come to my office to discuss the details. I blinked. Sole beneficiary? Wait, are you saying he left me something? More than something, Mr. Holloway replied. He left you everything. I sat down hard in my chair, my head spinning. This had to be a mistake. I hadn't spoken to Uncle Rick since I was a teenager. Why would he leave me anything? And how much was everything? Okay, I said, still in shock. When do you need me to come in? As soon as possible. There are some urgent matters to discuss regarding your inheritance. That phrase, urgent matters, sent a ripple of unease through me. I had no idea what I was walking into. But one thing was certain. For the first time in my life, the power was shifting in my favor. And I wasn't going to waste it. I barely remembered the drive to the lawyer's office. My mind was racing, flipping through memories of Uncle Rick, trying to piece together why me? Growing up, my father spoke about him with nothing but disdain. Rick's a bum, he'd say. Can't hold a job, can't keep a roof over his head. He's a failure. That was the extent of my knowledge. I had met him a handful of times at family gatherings, but he always stayed in the background, quiet, observant. While my father bragged about his latest scheme, or my mother gushed over my sister's accomplishments, Uncle Rick would just sip his drink and nod. He never got involved. Then, one day, he just disappeared from our lives. No one talked about him. No one seemed to care. But now, 10 years later, here I was, about to inherit everything from the man my father despised. When I arrived at the law firm, I expected some dingy little office with stacks of old papers and a guy in a cheap suit. Instead, I walked into a high-end firm, all glass walls and expensive leather chairs. The receptionist greeted me with the kind of polite indifference reserved for people who didn't belong. Mr. Carter? I turned to see a middle-aged man in a tailored suit, holding a file in his hands. "James Holloway," he said, shaking my hand. "Please follow me." I followed him down a long hallway into a sleek conference room. He gestured for me to sit. "I imagine you have a lot of questions," he began, flipping open the file. "Your uncle, Richard Carter, was a private man. But before he passed, he made sure his affairs were in order. You are the sole beneficiary of his estate, which includes his financial assets, properties, and business holdings." I blinked. "Business holdings? How much are we talking about?" I asked, hesitating. Mr. Holloway slid a piece of paper across the table. I picked it up and scanned the numbers. Then I froze. 7 figures. I read it again, my brain refusing to process it. This isn't possible," I said. "My father always said he was broke." "Your father was misinformed," Holloway said, his face unreadable. "Richard Carter was very successful. He made smart investments, ran multiple businesses, and lived modestly. That's why no one realized how much he was worth." I gripped the paper, my pulse hammering. My father had spent his whole life scrambling for money, demanding it from me whenever he messed up. And all this time, the real wealth in the family had belonged to the uncle he had mocked and ignored. I almost laughed at the irony. "So what now?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Now?" Holloway leaned forward. "Now you decide what you want to do with your inheritance. But I have a feeling you already have some ideas." And he was right. Because for the first time in my life, I was in control. And I knew exactly where to start. I left the law office with a folder full of documents, and a mind full of possibilities. The number, 7 figures, kept flashing in my head like a neon sign. I had gone from scraping by to being a millionaire in less than an hour. But this wasn't just about money. This was about power. For years, my father had used me like a personal bank, sucking me dry with his endless debts, guilt-tripping me into bailing him out every time he gambled away his paycheck. Every time I paid up, he acted like it was my duty, like I owed him for simply existing. Now, for the first time, I held the leverage. And I knew exactly how to use it. The first thing I did when I got home was dig into my father's financial situation. It wasn't hard, his debts were practically public knowledge. He owed money to everyone: banks, loan sharks, credit card companies. But one thing stood out. The biggest debt he had was to a private lender. Some local guy who had loaned him a large sum of money, probably under the table. And from what I could gather, my father was barely making the interest payments. I smirked. I had the money to buy out the debt. And once I owned it, I could do exactly what my father had done to me for years: call in the payment. Immediately. But I wasn't stopping there. A little more research led me to something even better. My parents' house, the house they had lived in for decades, was leveraged to the brink of foreclosure. One more missed payment, and the bank would seize it. So I made a call. Within 24 hours, I had purchased my father's debt. By the end of the week, I had also bought the rights to his house's foreclosure. And then I waited. 3 days later, my phone rang. It was my father. "Daniel, we need to talk." His voice was tight, impatient. "Oh? About what?" I played dumb, letting the silence stretch. "Cut the crap," he snapped. "I got a notice today saying my debts have been transferred to a new collector. The guy's demanding full payment. That wouldn't happen to be you, would it?" I smiled. "It is." There was silence on the other end. For the first time in my life, my father had nothing to say. "You wanted me to stay out of your life," I said, my voice calm. "I'm just following orders. Pay up, Dad. You have 7 days. Daniel, listen." I hung up. This was just the beginning. I didn't hear from my father for 2 days after that call. I imagined him pacing in his living room, checking his dwindling bank accounts, trying to figure out how to fix a situation that, for once, I controlled. But I wasn't done yet. I had already taken over his debts. Now, it was time for the house. Since I now held the rights to the foreclosure, all it took was a single push. A final notice was sent out, demanding immediate payment. I knew my father didn't have the money. He had always lived paycheck to paycheck, gambling away what little he had in hopes of a big win. This time, there was no one left to save him. The next call didn't come from my father. It came from my mother. "Daniel, please," she said the moment I answered. "Whatever you're doing, you have to stop." I almost laughed. Stop? Had they ever stopped when I was struggling? Had they ever hesitated to take from me, to drain me dry, leaving me with nothing? "I'm just doing what Dad always told me to do," I said. "Handling my responsibilities." "You're ruining us," she cried. "This is our home. And how many times did you tell me it wasn't your problem when Dad put himself in debt? You stood by while he bled me dry. And now? Now you care?" Silence. "You have 3 days to vacate the house," I said, my voice cold. "Consider this me finally staying out of your life." I hung up before she could respond. 3 days later, I stood outside the house as the eviction crew arrived. My father stormed out, his face red with rage. "You think this makes you a man?" he spat. "Destroying your own family?" I just watched as the movers started taking things out. "You told me to stay out," I said. "So I'm making sure you stay out too." He lunged at me, but I didn't flinch. "Get out of my sight," I said. "And don't ever come looking for me again." For the first time in my life, I walked away from them, without guilt, without hesitation. And for the first time in his life, my father was the one left with nothing. I expected my father to fight harder. To scream, to threaten, to drag me through another guilt trip. Instead, he just stood there, staring at the house as the movers carried out furniture, boxes, and whatever junk he had hoarded over the years. My mother clung to him, her face streaked with tears, but he looked hollow. Defeated. It was almost disappointing. "You always hated us," he muttered as I turned to leave. I stopped. "No," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "I just finally learned to stop loving people who don't love me back." With that, I walked away. By the end of the day, the house was officially mine. The locks were changed, and my parents were gone. For the first time, they were the ones with nowhere to go. I should have felt guilty. But I didn't. Because as I stepped inside, standing in what had once been their living room, I realized something. I had spent my whole life saving them. And now, for the first time, I had saved myself. But I wasn't done. Owning my father's house wasn't enough. I wanted to make sure he never recovered from this. So I dug deeper. It turned out, my father had more hidden debt than I thought. Old business loans, unpaid taxes, even money borrowed from old friends who had long since given up on seeing it repaid. And with my new resources, it was easy, too easy, to buy those debts out, one by one. By the time I was finished, my father didn't just owe money, he owed me. And I wasn't nearly as forgiving as the banks. A final notice was sent to him: pay up, or declare bankruptcy. I knew what he would choose. Because for the first time in his life, he had no one left to save him. My father was too proud to beg. Too stubborn to ask for mercy. But bankruptcy? That was something he couldn't ignore. The final notice hit him like a wrecking ball. Within 48 hours, his name was officially on the bankruptcy filing, plastered in legal documents for all the world to see. The man who had spent his life demanding handouts was now financially ruined. He had lost everything: his home, his credit, his reputation. And I made sure he knew exactly who was responsible. A single text: "Now we're even." He didn't reply. But I knew he got the message. Meanwhile, I turned my attention to the house. It wasn't just about taking it from them. I wanted to erase every trace of them from it. The first thing I did? Rip out every memory of them. The old furniture? Gone. The family photos? Trashed. Every reminder of the life they built on my back? Erased. And when the house was finally mine, clean, new, untouched by them, I made one final move. I sold it. Not because I needed the money, but because I wanted to make sure my father could never crawl his way back into it. The day the sale went through, I got another call. My mother. I debated ignoring it. But curiosity won. Daniel, she started, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. We need to talk. I leaned back in my chair smirking. About what? I said. Your father. She hesitated. He's not doing well. He's lost everything. You've made your point. Have I? I cut in. Silence. You were fine with me struggling, I said, voice calm. Fine with me drowning in debt for his mistakes. But now that he's suffering, it's suddenly a problem? It's not the same, she whispered. No, I agreed. Because this time, it's his problem. Not mine. And for the first time in her life, she had nothing left to say. I hung up. And I never answered her calls again. Weeks passed, and for the first time in my life, I felt free. No more late-night phone calls. No more begging for money. No more feeling like I owed them something just for existing. I had spent years drowning in their problems, but now? I was the one standing on solid ground, while they sank. But I wasn't quite finished yet. One night, I got a message from an unknown number. I almost ignored it. But when I opened it, I saw just one sentence. I need to see you. Please. I knew who it was before I even checked the number. My father. I almost deleted it. But then I thought, no. I wanted to see him, to see what he had become. So I sent a single reply. Tomorrow. 3 p.m. The diner on 5th. When I walked into the diner, I barely recognized him. The man who once stood tall, arrogant, always in control, was gone. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, his hands shaking as he stirred his coffee. And when he finally looked up at me, for the first time in his life, my father looked small. Daniel, he started, his voice hoarse. What do you want? I asked, keeping my tone cold. He exhaled shakily. I need help. I tilted my head, pretending to think. Help? That's funny. I seem to remember you telling me to stay out if I wasn't going to help. His face twisted. I didn't mean. You meant exactly what you said. I cut in. He clenched his jaw, trying to hold on to what little pride he had left. But I could see it, the desperation behind his eyes. Look, he muttered, rubbing his face. I messed up. I know that. But I'm still your father. I laughed. No, Dad. You were just a man who used me until I had nothing left to give. And now that I'm the one in power, you suddenly remember you're my father? Silence. Please, Daniel, he whispered. I have nowhere to go. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. Neither did I said. But you didn't care then. So why should I care now? His eyes widened, like he truly hadn't expected me to be this cold. Because I'm your family, he said weakly. I smirked. And you told me to stay out of my family. So now? I stood up, throwing some cash on the table for my coffee. You stay out of mine. And with that I walked away, leaving him alone, just like he had left me for years. I didn't look back as I walked out of the diner. I didn't need to. I had seen everything I needed to see. The once proud man who had lorded over me for years, who had demanded my obedience, my money, my sacrifices, was now nothing more than a broken man in a cheap diner, begging for scraps. And I had no sympathy left to give. That night I sat in my apartment, staring at my phone. I knew my father would try again. He always did. He had never been the kind of man to accept defeat, until now. Because for the first time, he had run out of people to manipulate. He couldn't run to my mother, she was just as lost as he was. He couldn't run to my sister, she had always relied on me to clean up their messes. And now, with no home, no money, and no one left to use, he was finally facing what he had forced me to face for years. Rock bottom. My phone buzzed. I expected another message from my father. Another desperate plea. But it wasn't him. It was my uncle's lawyer, James Holloway. Mr. Carter, I wanted to follow up regarding your uncle's estate. There's one more matter I'd like to discuss in person. Please call me when you have a moment. My stomach tightened. What else could there be? I had already received the inheritance, finalized the paperwork, and used that money to take back everything my father stole from me. I called him back. Mr. Carter, I'm glad you called, Holloway said. There's something I recently discovered while reviewing your uncle's documents. Something I believe you should know. Go on. Your uncle, Richard, had one final asset that was overlooked. A property. I frowned. I thought I already received everything. You did, except for this. It was a separate matter, something he had set aside years ago. And it's quite interesting. What kind of property? I asked. Holloway paused for a moment, then said something that made my blood go cold. Your father's first business. The auto shop. Your uncle bought it years ago, quietly. And now? It belongs to you. I sat there, gripping my phone, struggling to process what I had just heard. My father's old business. The one he lost due to his own failures. The one he had poured years of his life into before destroying it with his reckless spending. It was mine now. I almost laughed. Because in one final, unexpected move, my uncle had given me the last piece of leverage I needed. Not only had I taken my father's home, his money, and his pride. Now I owned the very thing he once prided himself on the most. The thing he lost. The thing he had failed to hold on to. And the best part? I had no intention of giving it back. So, Mr. Carter, Holloway said, would you like to schedule a time to visit your new property? I smiled. Absolutely. I stood outside the auto shop the next morning, staring up at the faded sign my father had once been so proud of. The place was run down, abandoned for years. Weeds cracked through the pavement, and the paint peeled from the walls. It was a perfect reflection of my father, once standing tall, now nothing. I walked through the doors, the scent of oil and rust still lingering in the air. This place had once been his dream. Now, it was mine to control. And I already knew exactly what to do with it. I made a call. Within a week, the property was sold. Not back to him. Not to someone he knew. But to a corporation that would tear it down and build something new. By the time my father found out, it was already too late. He called me, furious, desperate. You had no right, he screamed. I only had one thing left to say. I had every right. You made sure of that. And then I hung up.